So my name is Alex Elswick, and I'm an assistant extension professor for substance use prevention and recovery at UK. And I'm also a person in long-term recovery. So this is a subject that's personal and important to me. And as Liz said earlier, we have such a tight schedule because we have so many important things to cover tonight. And I was thinking about what's the best way I can make use of the 30 minutes that I've got, because I want to answer as many of the important questions as I can. And I figure we'll talk about the brain because because really at its core, it's what addiction is a brain disorder. And number two, because in understanding the brain, we answer so many of those essential questions that people ask, those important questions about addiction, like why do people get addicted and why don't they just stop? And what do they need to get better? The brain really holds the answer to all those questions. And so I'm going to try to do the best job I can of explaining that in 30 minutes or less, and then hopefully save some time to kick back to some of our other speakers. So we'll jump straight in. And my favorite place to begin this discussion always is by parachuting into the middle of this really contentious debate that we have in the field, which is addiction a choice or is addiction a disease? And that's really a false dichotomy because there's elements of both. And I love the way that Nora Volkow describes it, because Nora Volkow is the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse. So she's considered the leading addiction scientist in the United States. And she says that choices don't happen without a brain because it's the mechanism of choice. So the quality of a person's choices depends on the health of that mechanism. In other words, your brain is your choice organ. And the quality of your choices depends on the health or the quality of your choice organ. So if your chooser has become compromised, necessarily your choices become compromised. And that's exactly what happens in addiction. And it's also why it's not helpful to think about people making the choice to continue using drugs, because it's not a choice like in terms of volitional free will. It's a choice that's being made with a brain that's quite compromised. So what we're going to talk about is, what does it mean for the brain to be compromised? What's actually happened? What is the brain on drugs? And so maybe you all have seen this before. I always love to include this in presentations because it's just a wild, ludicrous example of an ineffective prevention campaign from back in the day. Turns out that's not actually your brain on drugs. So we are going to talk about your brain on drugs. And in my experience, as soon as I put up an image of the brain with some technical terms on it, that's when people start getting anxious and they think we're going back to school or something. And I promise you, I'm not here to make anybody memorize terms. I really don't even want you to. I just want everyone to have a working understanding of what's happening in the brain. And the best way I know to do that is to use my hands because apparently I just don't know how to do it with words. So put your hand out in front of you like this. Do it with me just for fun, just real quick. Put your hand out in front of you like this. Tuck your thumb into your palm and wrap your forefingers around your thumb. Boom, you got a brain right there. Okay, you can put your brains down. Okay, so if you talk to an evolutionary neuroscientist, so that is someone who's studied how the human brain has changed throughout human evolution, they'll tell you that our brains have evolved inside out. In other words, your four fingers there represent your cortices, the cortex, cortex multiple, which are the most highly evolved parts of our brain. So they're the parts of our brain that sort of separate us from other species and put us at the top of the food chain and allow us to like forecast into the future and make decisions and things like that. But if you peel back those four fingers and you move more towards the middle of your brain, now we're going back through human evolution to these structures that evolved much more further back in our evolutionary history. And you get to a part of the brain called the limbic system or the mesolimbic system. And it's also called our survival circuitry because it's the most important part of our brain that enables us to survive. And it's also the most important part of our brain to understand why addiction affects behavior the way that it does. So the way that it works is anytime we engage in any behavior that makes it more likely that we're going to survive to live another day. So we drink water, we eat food, we have sex, or we bond, form a relationship with another human being. All of those behaviors are rewarded through the release of this neurotransmitter called dopamine, which you all have probably heard of at some point through kind of pop science. Dopamine is the feel-good neurotransmitter. So in essence, what our brain is doing is it's conditioning us for survival. And more recently, I've started to think about this like potty training because I've got a new puppy. I got a 5-month-old Cavapoo, and his name's Buddy, and he's adorable. And it's like the best thing I ever did for my mental health during the pandemic. But anyways, every time I take Buddy outside to go to the bathroom and he goes potty, we celebrate, we make noise, and we give him a treat. And the reason we do that is we're trying to reinforce that behavior, condition him to do it again. And in so many ways, it's like our brains are potty training us for survival. It's like, oh, you took a sip of water. Here's a good boy. Here's a little dopamine treat, like, oh, you ate some food. That's a real good boy. You get a rub on the belly and a big dopamine treat, right? So fundamentally, this is how our brains motivate us to behave in a way that allows us to survive. And it's great, but it's a huge problem when it comes to addiction. And because it's so important to understand, I'm going to explain this in a couple different ways. I'm going to explain in words, and then I'm going to show you some brain scans and then some data. So if you don't get it just at first, just stick with me because we'll make sense of this. So I'm going to use myself as an example to explain this. So when I was 18 years old, I got exposed to prescription opioids, and I got a huge positive reward. So DA there represents dopamine. I got a huge flood of dopamine from using that opioid. It was in fact, it was an unnatural release of dopamine. And when I say the word unnatural, I mean, there's no behavior that I had engaged in my 18 years of life to that point that had ever brought about the same amount of dopamine that I got from that pill. And so, of course, plainly, it made me feel really good and euphoric, but it really runs deeper than that. It's also the fact that my brain became convinced that it's really important to my survival. Now, to the four fingers, the highly evolved part of our brain, that sounds ridiculous because that part of our brain can say, hey, that's just a good feeling that's coming from a pill or a powder or whatever it is. But my limbic system, much deeper in my brain, it's not as highly evolved, and it only measures the world around it in terms of dopamine. And to my limbic system, more dopamine always means more important to survival. So my brain learns early on that that pill or that powder must be some sort of magical potion that's important to my survival because I'm getting such a huge release of dopamine. So I'm inclined to repeat the behavior. But where addiction really sets in is that my brain and my body is always trying to maintain homeostasis, which just means balance. So even though you might think that your brain likes those huge spikes of dopamine because they're spikes of pleasure, our brains really don't because it's too volatile an environment. So what our brains do is they compensate on their own. And this is what really causes the addiction, is our brains trying to help us, but they hurt us in the process. Because what they do is they say, oh, I get what we're doing, Alex. We're taking this pill every day, and we're getting these huge floods of dopamine from outside our body. So what I'm going to do as your brain is I'm going to stop producing as much dopamine. So now when you use that drug again, you'll still feel good, but instead of going way up here, you'll just come into balance, right? So this is called dopamine downregulation. It's regulating the amount of dopamine you have downward. And this is what causes tolerance. So it's the reason why the first time you had a sip of alcohol, it didn't take much to achieve the desired effect. But as you drink more and more, you require more. So I created a graph to help explain this. It's kind of a simplistic graph, but I know this is a really difficult phenomenon to wrap our brains around. So thinking of dopamine on a scale of 0 to 10, 5 would be our baseline dopamine level. We'd wake up with a dopamine level of 5. And I get exposed to an opioid at 18 years old, and it takes me to a 10. It's the biggest dopaminergic response. That's what we would call it, a dopaminergic response. The greatest amount of dopamine I've ever experienced in my life, but eventually the effects of the drug wear off and I return to baseline. So now I'm inclined to use again because it felt good, I felt euphoric, but also that part of my brain, my limbic system, really thinks this is important to survival because I got such a big dopamine response. And so I have this really deep drive to use again. And so I use again, but eventually the effects of the drug wear off and I come back down to baseline. Now, through a period of using over days, weeks, months, and years, my brain catches on, right? We talked about how my brain doesn't really like these huge spikes because it's too volatile of an environment. So now my brain compensates on its own, like we said. So it stops producing as much dopamine. So when I use a drug, I still feel really good, but I don't feel as good as I used to, right? And so when you talk to people who have lived experience with addiction and they talk about chasing the dragon or chasing the first high, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about the kind of bait and switch that is addiction, because you can never recreate what you got in the first place, and then you're always chasing it. And just as importantly, as the brain starts to downregulate dopamine, now when the effects of the drug wear off, I don't just come back down to baseline, I come down slightly below baseline. And we're still talking about someone who's in early stage of addiction here. So they probably haven't experienced any legal consequences or social consequences. And yet, even at this early stage of addiction, when they don't have that drug on board, that drink, that pill, whatever it is, they're a little bit more anxious and a little bit depressed and a little bit irritable and just off in a number of ways. And so this gives them actually a second motivation to use again, because now they're using because it feels good, because their brain thinks it's important to their survival, but also because they don't want to feel bad. And this creates this positively reinforcing cycle of using and coming down and using and coming down. The entire time, dopamine levels are trending downward, downward, downward in your brain until you reach a point where you have to use a drug to feel the way you used to feel when you woke up in the morning. And so when you think about, we talk about functioning alcoholism or functioning addiction, it's essentially what we're referring to. We're talking about a person whose addiction is in such a place where they have to have a drug on board to function, right? And at this point, at end stage addiction, when a person can't get their hands on their drug of choice, their medicine, either because they're incarcerated or they go to treatment or they're just trying to be abstinent, you feel absolutely miserable. And it's a special kind of misery. And I'm really not talking about physical withdrawals at all here, because we're just focusing on what's happening in the brain. So I want to show this to you in another way. This is kind of cool. These are called PET scans. So that's positron emission tomographies. They're basically just these fancy pictures that we're able to take of brains. So what we do is we inject this radioactive chemical into people's brains that has a really high affinity for dopamine receptors. And what that means for us is when we look at the brains on these scans, we can see dopamine activity illuminated. We can just see it light up. So what you're looking at here, the brain on the left is a healthy, normal control brain. So it's a person who doesn't use drugs. And the person on the right is a person who's addicted to cocaine. And there's a really obvious, demonstrable difference between these two brains in terms of how much dopamine they have. So the brain on the right has just undergone this process that I've explained to you of dopamine downregulation. Through continuing to use cocaine over and over again, their brain has slowly but surely depleted its dopamine. So what I want us to do is to pause and think about how these two brains experience the world around them, because it helps you to get an understanding of what's happening to the addicted brain. So the person on the left sees some food sitting on the counter, some Chick-fil-A maybe, because I do like Chick-fil-A. Little grilled nuggies. So there's some Chick-fil-A grilled nuggies sitting on the counter, and the person on the left, they have enough dopamine in their brain to motivate them to go and eat the food. And they also have enough dopamine in their brain to reward them for eating the food. So as a result, that's exactly what they do. They engage in the behavior and they go eat the food. That's a normal, healthy person with a normal, healthy brain. The person on the right sees the food sitting on the table, but they don't have enough dopamine in their brain to motivate them to go eat the food, nor would they have enough dopamine to reward them for eating the food. And as a consequence, they're less likely to eat. So you think about your stereotype of someone who becomes addicted, what do they look like? They're gaunt and malnourished and often underweight. And part of the reason for that is because of what's happened in terms of dopamine downregulation in the brain, to the extent that food is no longer a sufficient stimulus for this brain. And what's interesting is there's kind of a similar thing happening in the case of Parkinson's disease. So folks who get Parkinson's are sort of immobilized, and they're immobilized because of a lack of dopamine, because dopamine is the chemical you need to motivate behavior. When you think, I want to get up and walk across the room, you need dopamine in order to do that. And so addicted brains that have really depleted dopamine are really hard to motivate. It's hard to get a person who has an addicted brain to be motivated for much of anything other than the drug, because the drug is the only thing sufficient to bring about motivation. One more example. Let's say the person on the left goes to Starbucks to have a cup of coffee and a conversation with a friend. Because of the dopamine they have in their brain, they're able to experience that feeling of connectedness, that feeling of bonding. People describe it as warmth so often, right? That feeling of closeness with another human being. The person on the right goes to Starbucks to have the same cup of coffee and the same conversation, but they don't have enough dopamine in their brain to experience real connectedness and bonding. And as a result, it's sort of an empty interaction for them. And that's, so again, think of your stereotype of someone who's addicted. Do they have lots and lots of friends? Probably not. They probably spend a lot of time isolating. And part of the reason for that is because of what's happened to their brains, because they no longer have the dopamine they need to feel connected with people. And it makes social interactions very strained and not very rewarding. So hopefully that gives you at least a slightly better understanding of what's happening in the addicted brain. And I want to show you one more brain scan that's just as important. So same thing, we're still looking at the same kind of brain scan. Now the brain on the far left is our healthy, normal control brain. And the brain in the middle looks just like that addicted brain that I showed you before. But here's the catch. That's not actually the brain of someone who's addicted. That's the brain of someone who was addicted to methamphetamine and now they're 30 days sober, 30 days abstinent. And what you notice is that brain still looks almost identical to this addicted brain, right? In terms of both appearance and function, they're almost identical, even though this person is 30 days abstinent. So for the sake of argument, we can imagine someone who's just left a treatment center, for instance, a 30-day treatment center. And they still have an utterly addicted brain, a brain that is utterly compromised, which means their decision-making will be utterly compromised. And it's a huge problem because this is essentially the way we've been trying to address addiction. We have somebody who gets addicted and we send them to treatment, and they spend 30 days in treatment. And while they're there, they get better, right? Their tolerance goes down, their withdrawals go away, their cravings go down, things are getting better. And then after 30 days, we have a graduation ceremony, which suggests to people that they're finished, when in fact, they're very far from finished. And we release them out into the community with brains just like this brain in the middle, very much addicted brains, very much compromised brains. We expect them to make sober decisions. And when they don't, we often shame them and tell them it's their fault and tell them they chose to use drugs or chose drug use over their children or something really hurtful like that. When what we're not acknowledging is even after 30 days of abstinence, people still have very compromised brains, very compromised brains. So where's the hope? Where's the hopeful part? Well, the hopeful brain is on the far right. That's the brain of someone who was addicted to methamphetamine and now they're 2 years in recovery. And what you notice is that brain looks a heck of a lot more like a healthy, normal control brain. That brain has begun to do some significant healing as a part of its recovery process. That brain doesn't really seem to have compromised decision-making. We can have confidence in that person's ability to make good decisions. The problem is that's after 2 years, right? And our whole treatment industry is set up to address addiction in little acute bits, little acute episodic bits. And I know that from personal experience because I went around this merry-go-round 7 times of going to treatment and getting out and relapsing and going to treatment and getting out and relapsing. And unfortunately, in the context of an opioid overdose epidemic, we can't even be confident that our loved ones are going to survive another round of treatment and relapse, right? We got to get it right the first time. And so what does it look like to get it right the first time? What does it look like to help support people as their brain is healing over that period of time? Well, first, let's take a look at kind of matching data to what's happening in the brain, because this is kind of interesting. So you're looking at the likelihood that a person will stay in recovery based on how long they've already been in recovery. And it's kind of complicated. So blue bars represent males, orange bars represent females. The first block of data on the far left, these are folks who have been in recovery for less than a year. So for the sake of argument, we can imagine someone who's just left short-term incarceration or someone who's just left, a 30-day treatment center. And what you see is on average, only about 35% of them will remain in recovery. That means 65% will relapse. This is pretty consistent with rates of relapse we see with all chronic diseases. Those are not terribly hopeful numbers. But the hope, again, is after 2 years, somewhere between 3 and 5 years, you see this plateau effect where your risk of relapsing drops below 15%. And that's an important number for us because that's actually the risk of addiction in the general population. So when your risk of relapse falls below 15% after 3, 4, 5 years, that's when we could say a person has reached full clinical remission. And what's interesting about the fact that people have so much success after 3 or 5 years is look back at this brain. When you think about what's happening in the brain, it makes sense that people are having success, that once somebody's brain has healed for 2 years, 2.5, 3 years, that they're in a place where we can be reasonably confident that they can maintain their recovery the rest of the way. And so what these brain scans tell me, and also what this data tells me, is that we've got to be thinking about how to support people over the long term. Like, treatment is really important for people who have severe substance use disorders like I did. Treatment is really important as a kind of crisis intervention, kind of stabilization, kind of start your recovery. But recovery continues when you leave treatment. And there's a lot more work to do. There's years to come. And so we have to find ways to support people. And so in 2 minutes or less, I'm going to kind of describe to you what that looks like. I call it recovery capital. You can just call them recovery resources. Recovery capital is just a way of thinking about what are all of the things that people need to maintain their recovery after treatment, or if they don't go to treatment. And so it's things like, does this person have stable housing? Do they have adequate housing? Do they have safe housing? Is it housing that's free from drugs and alcohol? Is it a good emotional environment for a person to be living in? What kind of mental health do they have? And what kind of mental health needs do they have? Do they have anxiety or depression that's going unaddressed? Do they have trauma, either from their addiction or from their childhood, that hasn't been processed, right? These are all things that that can threaten your recovery, that can be potential sources of stress that contribute to relapse. And so there are things that have to be addressed. Nothing magical happens when we send people to treatment, right? There is no magic potion. People need to be supported when they get out. And it also involves the community at large. Is the community open to second chance transformative employment for people who have felonies, for people who have drug charges, for people who were addicted? Is it a community that's free from stigma, that's open to supporting recovery, all these kinds of things. And so in thinking about what it's like to provide these resources for people, I want to kind of finish by just sharing a quick story. My first job when I got into recovery, so I had been homeless in my addiction. I'd been sleeping under a bridge in Dayton, Ohio, and I ended up going to a Salvation Army, which is just a homeless shelter in Dayton, started getting better. And when I got out of the Salvation Army, the first job I got back in Kentucky was working in a tobacco field in UK College of Ag, actually. Technically, what we were doing was research trying to find varieties of tobacco that had fewer carcinogens, but that's what the brainiacs were doing. I was doing the manual labor and moving dirt, right? But the reason I bring it up is because we used to raise the tobacco in these float trays in these greenhouses. And the thing I noticed about the plants in these greenhouses is it was this perfect environment for the plants rather to grow and thrive, because they had steady access to sunlight and to water and air quality control and nutrients. And when the plants reached a sufficient level of maturation, we would take the float trays and load them onto trucks and take them out to the field to set the tobacco. And if the soil in the field was good and there was adequate sunlight and adequate rainfall and it was free from disease, then we would set the plants and the plants would grow and thrive. But if we set the plants in bad soil where there was some type of disease or where there were trees blocking sunlight, then the plants would wilt and die. And it occurs to me that this is a perfect analogy for treatment and recovery, because treatment centers are like greenhouses for people who are addicted, because they're climate controlled. They're these perfect environments that have limited stress, right? Limited outside world stressors. You have steady access to peer support and educated counselors and mental health treatment, and you get 3 nutritious meals a day, and you have a safe place to lay your head at night. It's like, I think of it like Fort Knox for recovery capital, right? It's like the bank for all the recovery things you need. And that's why people tend to have so much success while they're in treatment. I always did. I always walked out of treatment some 30, 60, 90 days sober, doing well. The problem was when they took me out of the greenhouse and set me in the soil, right? The problem was I kept setting in the same bad soil. And so no matter how healthy I'd gotten in 30 days or 90 days, putting me back in the same soil with bad nutrients always led to relapse. And the last time I got lucky, I don't know why it happened the way that it did, but I found myself in good soil. the last time I found myself surrounded by the people and the resources that I needed to get well. And so really, as we're thinking about what addiction is doing to the brain and how long people need to be supported, it gives us an idea that all of us in the community have a role to play in supporting people, in providing opportunities, and giving people the things that they need to get better. So I know that was a quick and dirty explanation of addiction and recovery, but I'm going to go ahead and stop here and cede the rest of my time so that folks we'll have plenty of time for our panel discussion.
Our next speaker is the coordinator of the Boyle County Agency for Substance Abuse Policy, a licensed clinical alcohol and drug counselor, and a licensed marriage and family therapist with more than 40 years of experience in mental health and substance use disorder work. Welcome, Kathy Miles.
Thank you, Alethea. It's always good to work with Alethea. We've done lots of projects together. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Casey's Law and give you all a kind of a general overview of what Casey's Law is and how it fits into all of what we're talking about tonight. But I also want to say that we wouldn't have a law like Casey's Law if we didn't have the research and the information that Alex just presented. So it's really important to have that information, to know that neuroscience has allowed us to move way beyond where we used to be in the way we understood substance use disorders. And so that's kind of the background context for understanding Casey's Law. We're going to go to the next page on this because I want to talk about Casey for a minute. I want you to see his picture. So Casey Wethington is a young man, like many young men and women and people who aren't so young, who had an addiction and who was an adult. So his family could not get help for him, and he didn't think he had a problem. And so when an adult, as you understand now from thinking about what Alex talked to us about the brain and the impaired ability to make choices, when an adult won't choose to get help, it's really, really hard for the family. And I'm sure that most people on this in this webinar have either experienced that yourself in your families, or you have friends who have experienced that. He had a heroin addiction, died in 2002. His mom believed in treatment. She still believes in treatment, but she could not find a way to get him mandated treatment. She took her incredibly large grief and turned it into advocacy and worked from 2002 until in July of 2004, Casey's Law was enacted. She was a tireless fighter for the ability in Kentucky to get mandated treatment for substance use disorders for adults who haven't chosen to get that help themselves. 2004 sounds like a long time ago, and you would think that everybody would know about it, but we know that that's not been the case. We know that in some counties, this law has never been used, even since 2004. And we know that in other counties, and I will lift up the counties that have used it the most are usually the ones who have advocates, who have people like Charlotte, and who have taken it upon themselves to educate people about the law, to walk the walk with them as you go through the process of using it, and to help people know where to turn.
I'm going to interrupt you for just a second. We are going to turn your video off to make sure that your audio is much more amazing. Okay, is that all right with you?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Is that better?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So what Casey's Law does do is allow parents or other relatives or friends to petition the court on behalf of a person who suffers from a substance use disorder, asking for professional evaluations to be considered by a judge, and in order to have the judge mandate appropriate involuntary treatment. So in a nutshell, that's what the law does. It also allows family members to override the statements that Charlotte Wethington and family after family have heard from people. Things like, you have to wait till someone hits bottom, or you have to wait until they want help. What we know now, and Alex has kind of helped to really highlight that, what we know now is that mandated treatment does work, that people don't have to start out in a treatment program wanting help. In fact, they often don't because of the effect on the brain of the substance. We also know, because we live in a world with extra dangerous and deadly substances, that hitting bottom in the world that we live in today often means dying. And that's certainly what Charlotte came to understand as a mother. So families who live with a person with an active addiction want their loved one to live and be in recovery in the same way that families who live with a family member with other chronic illnesses want them to get treatment and to be healthy and live as well as they can with that disorder. So there are lots of analogies to other illnesses. We just have so much stigma that surrounds people having a substance use disorder. So let's go to the next slide, and let me briefly go over with you what are the steps to take in using Casey's Law. And there's some details to this that we just don't have time to do tonight. So can we go to that next page? I want you all to be able to see that. Yeah. So the first thing I would say to a family member who's thinking about doing this is similar to a family member who's thinking about doing an intervention with a loved one who has an alcohol or other drug problem. And that is to think about, are you willing to go through the hard stuff? Are you willing to do what you need to do, even though that person may get really angry with you? If any of y'all in this webinar have ever been involved in interventions, you know that the immediate effect is not always, it's hard. It's not always pleasant. And you always have to keep in the back of your head, I'm doing this because I love this person. I'm doing this because I know without help, they may not live, but they may not like what I'm doing in the immediate situation. There's a similar response with Casey's Law. So thinking through, what am I going to do to get support as I walk through this as the person filing a petition, and thinking through the criteria. The criteria as established in the law are that the person has to suffer from a substance use disorder. That has to be a diagnosed substance use disorder. They have to present an imminent threat of danger to their self, a family member, or others as a result of that substance use disorder. And it also has to appear that without change in treatment, that threat would continue and might increase, and that they can reasonably benefit from treatment. So those are the three criteria that you think through before you begin the process. There is a form on www.caseyslaw.org that helps you kind of think through, put your case together as you start to work on this. It's called a screening questionnaire, and I would encourage family members who want to go through the process to do your homework and to pull that form up and begin to think about what are the pieces of this person's history, what is happening, what's happened to them, what kind of situations have we seen in our family, how many times have they overdosed, what are their related physical health issues, and write all those down and spend some time working on that as you get ready to file a petition. A petition is going to require that this person have 2 qualified health professionals assess them. One of them has to be an MD or a DO, and the other one can be a licensed mental health professional. The evaluation forms are also found on www.caseyslaw.org, and probably your circuit court clerk's office has those forms, and sometimes the county attorney's office does as well. Some professionals in some counties will do those evals at no charge, and sometimes some of them can do them and bill insurance. It varies from situation to situation. You do want to make sure that you have people, as you make those appointments for those evaluations for that person, you want to make sure that you have people who are trained in and understand substance use disorders. You're going to be filing a petition with the circuit court clerk in the county of residence of the person with the substance use disorder. That may not necessarily be your county if you are the family member or a close friend filing this. The court, and you should go with those appointments already made when you go and file that petition. That form is also available in those same places. The court has to review the petition and orders evaluations to be done within 14 days. So that's why you need to have those appointments already made. You want to have those evaluations are to be done as scheduled, and the forms have to come back to the courthouse no later than 24 hours prior to the court date. It is the petitioner's responsibility to locate a detox and a treatment facility. But the good news is, and some people don't know this, we do have some free treatment centers in Kentucky. So all is not lost if you're worried about the person not having insurance or Medicaid or money to pay. And so I've listed an 1-800 number for Recovery Kentucky centers. Those are centers that can take people at no charge. And the big website that helps you know where beds available is www.findhelpnowkentucky.org. This is a very helpful website that we waited for a long time until it was finally developed. And there are also, if you have an advocacy center in your county, advocates who know Casey's Law well can help you find treatment folks to talk with about where might be the most appropriate place for this person to get treatment. If you heard what Alex said earlier, I think it behooves you, if you're going to do a petition on a family member, to be careful not to ask for too little. The judge can actually order up to 60 days, from up to 60 days to not more than 360 days. And this will depend on your request as a petitioner, on the evaluations done by the 2 professionals, and the results of the hearing. But remember that it does take a while for the brain to heal, and treatment that is too short cannot be as very valuable. So that's something to think about. On the next slide, you'll see the information about where's more information found about Casey's Law. So you can read the law on the LRC website. Casey'sLaw.org is an excellent website. And a group in Stanton, Kentucky, Spark Ministries, are amazing people who have helped so many of us across the state. understand and learn about Casey's Law and help people walk through the process. And I've also given you that information. Jefferson County has a little bit of a different process for Casey's Law, and so they have a separate section on the CaseysLaw.org website about what the process is in Jefferson County. In your county, it may be your county attorney's office, it may be the circuit court clerk's office, you may have a volunteer advocate. You may want to start an advocacy center in your county if you don't have one. Our county we are just working on really pulling that together and doing that in Boyle County. And I'm happy to send you what we've been working on. We just developed a specific brochure for Boyle County that has phone numbers and outreach just for our county. And finally, I just want to say, as we talk about other support resources for families, substance use disorder is a family illness, just like lots of illnesses are. It affects everyone in the family. All family members can benefit from support and information. And I've listed a few of those organizations. They're not all found in all counties, but we're lucky now that we've had COVID. We're not lucky that we've had COVID, but we're lucky that a lot of these organizations have gone online with their support meetings. So I would encourage anyone who has a family member in active addiction to get that support and help for themselves as well.
Thank you so much, Kathy. We really appreciate your expertise and the information that you've been able to offer today. Right now, I get the privilege of introducing Toby Reeser-Shero. She works for the University of Kentucky CURT Project, and she's worked with people with substance use disorder doing HIV risk reduction for 15 years. She has a degree in sociology from Eastern Kentucky University, and she's lived in Mercer County most of her life. Without further ado, I will turn the microphone over to Miss Toby Reeser.
Good evening, everybody. I'm so glad you could be here. So, like she said, my name's Toby. I run the Harm Reduction Syringe Exchange Program at the Mercer County Health Department. So I'm here to talk about Narcan. So why do we even need to talk about Narcan? So right now, the number one cause of death for those people under 50 is accidental overdose. So we need to talk about Narcan because it can save lives. If we can, let's go to my other handout first, and we'll touch on that real quick, and then we'll go through this one. Perfect. So overdose, like I said, is preventable. And I just want to put these resources out there because in the pandemic, unfortunately, some of the overdose numbers are starting to come through, and it's looking very scary for the numbers that we're going to see from last year. So overdose is preventable. The number one rule we always tell people when they use drugs is you should never, ever use alone. If you do have to use alone, there's the Never Use Alone number. It's a toll-free number. They can call. They'll stay on the line with the person while they use. Second up is the Canary app. It works a lot of the same way that the Never Use Alone app does. It will alert someone that you set up that you could potentially have a medical emergency. I always tell people about fentanyl test strips because, again, that's why we need to talk about Narcan. The drug supply, unfortunately, right now is heavily tainted with fentanyl. And it's not just heroin. There's fake pressed pills on the street. It's in meth. It's in everything. So we have to be very aware. And then we always need to carry Narcan, always. We can go back to the other page now. So why Narcan? What is Narcan? Narcan or naloxone is a medication that will temporarily reverse the effects of an overdose. But again, like I said, it's temporary. It only lasts for about 30 to 90 minutes. So what happens is it's an opioid antagonist. It works in the brain. You've got a receptor in your brain. So say my tooth is hurting and I take a pain pill. That pain pill attaches to that receptor in my brain and I don't feel that pain anymore. So when we've got a lot of opiates in our brain and all of the receptors are full, our body kind of forgets to breathe, basically. So when we give a dose of Narcan, those receptors in our brain like Narcan better than it does those opioids. So it'll release the opioid and grab onto that Narcan. That way, the person will wake back up. So It's safe to give Narcan even if you don't know what substance the person is on, because if there's not an opiate on that receptor in your brain, then you don't have to worry about there being a negative side effect. So where do you get Narcan? Most local health departments give out Narcan, will do Narcan training for free. Most of the surrounding counties, like I said, Mercer County, Bull, Woodford, Fayette County, anywhere that has a harm reduction syringe exchange program can give out Narcan. Most health insurance cover Narcan. Medicaid, I believe it's covered 100%. So without a copay, you can go to the pharmacy and get it. And then there's the Kentucky CORE effort going on right now, which is the Kentucky Opioid Response Effort. And that grant is providing most health departments, police, fire, and first responders Narcan for free right now. So when do you give Narcan? When somebody has too many opioids in their body basically forgets to breathe. Sometimes it can look or sound like the person is just sleeping, but how can we tell the difference? So signs of an overdose that may require medical attention include blue lips, slow or shallow breathing, pinpoint or dilated pupils, confusion, unconsciousness, unresponsiveness, and nausea and vomiting. And sometimes, like I said, it sounds like they're snoring. It's be a gurgling sound. And so what we want to do at that point is you give a sternal chest rub. So you take your knuckle and you hit the sternum and you rub hard. Because if they're just at that point where they're teetering and they might just have overdone it a little bit, but they might not be overdosed, that hurts when you do that. So it should bring them back to where they're responding. And if at that point they don't respond, then you know you need to proceed with Narcan. So how do you give Narcan? The first thing you always want to do is call 911 to get help on the way. So Narcan, see if you can see it through my screen, but it's very easy. So Narcan was first created and it was an injectable form. But the injectable form, you have to have medical training. You've got to know how to use a syringe, how to be able to draw that up into the syringe out of the vial. And so they came out with one that is very easy to use. It's almost impossible to use it wrong. And like I said, it's just a nasal spray. You stick the tip of the nozzle in the nose and push the plunger. It is basically that simple. When you get a box of Narcan at the health department, that background's making it crazy. It comes in a box like this, and it comes with 2 packs, and they're blister packed. And you can see on the new ones, the nozzle is red. So again, it's very easy to use, almost impossible to mess up. When you put it in the nose and you push the plunger, the person doesn't have to inhale like that. It's absorbed through the mucosal membrane in the nose. So as long as you can get it into the nose, then it should work. So why should you have Narcan? Because like we talked about, accidental drug overdose is the leading cause of death for people under 50. As far as I'm concerned, Narcan should be a part of everybody's first aid kit these days. We never know what's going to happen or where we're going to run up on an instance where we might need Narcan. Sometimes when we call 911 to get help, it takes the first responders a long time to get to your location. Having Narcan on hand could mean the difference between life or death in that situation. And it's not only people with substance use disorder that you have to worry about Narcan and having Narcan around. So if you have an older person in your life, sometimes they might be on an opioid medication. Maybe they forget that they've already taken it. Maybe there's 2 caregivers and one person gave it and forgot to write it down. But anybody that's prescribed an opiate, I feel like should also have a Narcan, because again, you just never know what could happen. Narcan is safe to use on anybody, like I talked about. Pregnant people, animals, it's okay to use. And then 2, we need Narcan because everybody with substance use disorder matters to somebody. It's somebody's daughter, somebody's son, somebody's mom. Somebody out there cares about them. And sometimes we have to keep them alive until they want to be alive for themselves. And unfortunately, that's my job a lot of days in the syringe exchange. It's training people about Narcan, how to use it so that we can save lives. I had a good question in chat. You should not store Narcan in your car. It is temperature sensitive. It can freeze in winter and it can become not as good in the summer. So it should be stored at regular room temperature. And what I do is I take mine out of the box, keep one blister pack in my purse, and keep the other one in my house or my office. And then that way I keep my purse with me everywhere. So that way it's always in a temperature controlled place. And if you are ever in a situation where you've witnessed an overdose and you don't have Narcan, of course, always call 911 and get medical help on the way. Second, you want to breathe for them because, like I said, the opiates make the body forget to breathe. So you want to tilt their head back, pinch their nose. You give them one breath every 5 seconds until help can get there. And then if they happen to start to vomit or come to, you want to put them in rescue breathing position on their side. So that way, if they do start to vomit, they don't aspirate on their vomit. And then stay with them until help arrives. One important thing that I always tell people is there is the Good Samaritan law. So if you're ever around somebody that's overdosed, and a lot of my clients that are in the syringe exchange program get scared to call 911 because they're afraid of the consequences from the police. The Good Samaritan law does protect them from getting arrested for getting help. Of course, there are certain circumstances where that doesn't apply, but for the most part, we want to save lives. And they enacted this law because too many people were dying because people were scared to call and get help. So don't ever be afraid to call 911 and get help there. And like I said, if anybody ever wants a full Narcan training, I would be glad to host you here at the Mercer County Health Department. And I can also come out and train any businesses if you would like to keep Narcan there. And that's all I have. I have the flyer there. It has all the basic information that I just went over. And if there's ever anything that anybody needs, I'll put my information in the chat box. I'd look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so with us tonight, I'm going to share just our panel individuals and what organization they work for. And then we have their full bios that we will send to you later. So we have Cassandra Harris Gray, and she is the CEO and founder of Creative Spirits Behavioral Health and Outpatient Substance Abuse Mental Health and Violence Prevention Center, dedicated to helping individuals transform their lives through emotional, physical, and spiritual healing. We have Roger Fox. He is the Vice President of Community Programs for the Shepherd's House, a nonprofit drug and alcohol treatment program. Ashley Lopez, who is both a mother and a leader, and she works as a client care navigator for the Isaiah House Treatment Center. And then we have Ted Dean, who is the Mercer County Attorney.
So I'm going to start with Ashley. Ashley, you're a person in long-term recovery. So can you just talk a little bit about your experience with addiction, how you found yourself with a substance use disorder?
So I was raised in a family with, we had a lot of alcoholics, a lot of different things going on. I grew up in it. That was my norm. So I also, though, believe that I was born differently. My thought process, the way I felt, there was just always something missing. And so whenever I got to the age where I was experimenting with different substances, that's whenever I kind of was able to feel that relief that, okay, this must be what normal people feel like. It sounds cheesy, but I always felt like everyone else had directions to life and I didn't get a copy. So that's just kind of how my addiction got started, just, experimenting in high school. And then it was just different. That was it for me. That's what made me normal. It felt like that was the only thing that was able to make me normal.
Yeah, I appreciate that response. I'm a person in recovery too, and I know what you mean. The instruction booklet that everybody seemed to get. Yeah, we got left off that memo, and I get that. Cassandra, I'm going to turn to you now for a moment. You see people who struggle with addiction and recovery every day. And so I'm wondering about the connection between addiction and mental health. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So what we're finding today is there's definitely a correlation between the two. We have a lot of people that are experiencing co-occurring disorders, especially when we're talking about utilizing heroin or fentanyl or some of those drugs. There's a psychological aspect of that during detox and even after, with some of the long-lasting effects of that type of use. So yes, we're able to provide co-occurring services for those individuals that are dealing with both substance and mental health.
And when you're working with someone who has a co-occurring, a substance use disorder and also a co-occurring disorder, how do you proceed? Do you work with one first? Do you address the addiction first, the mental health, or do you address them at the same time?
So when we conduct our assessments, we try to look to see, of course, substance abuse will always be the primary, because most of the time it's leading into the mental health issue. It could be substance abuse related. So we always try to make sure that we cover that substance abuse piece first, and then, work on the individual being able to, deal with their mental health issue. If we see there's been long-term mental health prior to use, then of course we're going to deal with the mental health issues, around that and do that, simultaneously. But if we can see that the mental health piece has come on since the onset of substance abuse, we're going to deal with that substance abuse piece first. So that's what we'll be doing. That's how we handle that within our center. We're an outpatient center and we're community-based. So we offer intensive outpatient for those that are dealing with substance abuse. And then we offer a mental health piece that goes along with that, with the individuals too as well.
Okay, thank you. Ted, turning to you now, you're a Mercer County attorney, and in that role, you prosecute drug crimes. And so I'm curious, just based on what you're seeing in court, kind of give us a sense of the patterns of what drugs we're seeing and just kind of what drug-related crime we see in your area.
Sure. The drugs we see are typically the opioid-based drugs. We're seeing a lot of heroin. We are seeing a lot more methamphetamine coming back. Obviously, the thing that people are most concerned with are the fentanyl and the carfentanil drugs that are showing up. And unfortunately, now they are showing up in what people would assume to be prescription medication. They're laced with that. And that is obviously a game changer. That's where the Narcan becomes very, very important. People get a hold of that. They don't know that they're getting it. They don't know how much is there. And that they can easily get too much. As far as the crimes we see, the majority of our theft crimes are drug related. You've got simple possession charges, you've got trafficking charges, but generally your petty theft is shoplifting. A lot of that is simply drug related. A lot of and I'll call them inside crimes, where you've got people, children stealing from parents, parents stealing from children or other family members. Those are often drug related as well. People typically seek their loved ones to steal from because they feel like they can guilt or shame them into not going to law enforcement for prosecution.
And can you give us a sense of the scale and the scope of just drug problem in Mercer County, just based on drug arrests or drug related crime?
I would, my sheriff and I talked not too long ago, and we figure that probably 85% of our crime is drug. It's either people who are on drugs, people who are possessing or selling drugs, or people who are doing things to seek drugs.
Couldn't possibly be a more pressing issue than this, right?
It is the most pressing issue that we face in the Commonwealth. No question.
Roger, I want to bring you here. At this point, you're a person who has lived experience both with addiction and with incarceration. And today you do a lot of tremendous advocacy around that. And so I'm just curious about barriers that you faced when it was time for reentry, as you were leaving incarceration and coming back in to kind of rebuild your life.
Sure. This time, what made it different when I got out of prison in 2015 was exactly what you were talking about earlier, is that, I was planted in some healthy soil. I was given access to the tools and resources to build this capital, coming from a rural community. And when I was in active addiction, years ago, I would come home and there weren't these resources. Communities weren't investing in these resources to provide. And that's one thing that I can always say about Boyle and Mercer County, is that in the last 5 years, I've never seen a community that invests in its individuals, and Ted makes that investment, the courts makes that investment, Kathy Miles makes that investment to link the resources, to help people build recovery capital in themselves, in their families, and in the community, right? Because it all has to go together. It has to go hand in hand. And when we do that, we see our communities becoming stronger. We see these becoming safe places for individuals like myself and Ashley and you to come back to reintegrate, to reunify with their families, to build these relationships again, and to become productive citizens in these communities.
Yeah, right on. Well, Ashley, Roger's talking about some of these resources that were available to him when he got out that really helped him as a part of his recovery. And I'm wondering for you, just what were the ingredients? What were the pieces of the puzzle that needed to be in place to help your recovery come together?
Well, a lot like Roger, I was placed in a long-term treatment center, not by choice. A very structured environment with, huge support and resources. In Richmond, Kentucky, that's where I was. There's a huge recovery community there. And I really think the big difference, because I'm from here, I'm from Lincoln County. And so there wasn't, back in 2015, you didn't have all these recovery advocates. You didn't have all these resources. I honestly knew maybe one person that had gotten sober from where we're from. And so that made the biggest difference for me. And I made the decision for myself once I completed treatment to stay in Richmond and kind of build my, foundation in recovery. And I just recently moved back home last year. And it's grown so much. Roger's done a great job. And IH has, moved in this direction, and, the courts and everything. I've just seen such a growth in treatment and just all the different resources, and the stigma, it's still there, but it's gotten so much better since whenever I was made to go to treatment, because we didn't have any of that here. So it was definitely the soil in Richmond, Kentucky. It would have been a different, I still say it. I believe if I would have moved back home right out of treatment, I don't know if my story would have been the same.
Well, Cassandra, when you're working with somebody who's in that position that we're talking about with Ashley, somebody who's in early recovery, what are some of the things you're doing with somebody in therapy? I think sometimes therapy is kind of black box, and we think it's like just kind of magic. And so kind of break that down for us. What are some of the things you're doing to support people in therapy?
Well, one of the things I would like to say is I'm very excited about hearing about when we start talking about recovery capital, because one of the things that we established with our facility is becoming that for our clients. So when clients return home, we have therapists, we have case managers, we have peer support that's ready to walk alongside. We work with helping them to reestablish, to get homes, to get jobs. So we want to make sure that we're utilizing the resources that are in our communities and become advocates for our clients to help them to be able to reintegrate right back into to their community and plug right back in. So we provide that. We also work with other partners. Right now, we're partnering with Goodwill throughout the Louisville area. And so they're one of our major partners. We've established a housing initiative together. Anything that we can do to help make and help establish a safe space for individuals that are dealing with substance abuse and mental health issues, we want to make sure that we give them every opportunity possible. So, and I'm also a rural girl. I'm from Shelbyville. And so my first practice started in Shelbyville, and we covered 5-county area. And at the time it was us in 7 counties. And what I saw was people were coming out of jail and going right back. And so my husband and I, we thought about, we're doing private practice, and that's great, but there has to be a step further that we're willing to take. So we became a licensed behavioral health service organization, which allows us to use multiple disciplinary types of care, and they can utilize their Medicaid card. We're an in and out. So if you come in and you don't have insurance with the ACA now, we make sure that people are able to get plugged in to be able to come back. And so we try to utilize all the resources possible to make sure that our people know that our community needs them and that we want them, and we want to make sure they have every opportunity possible. So that's our story. We've been doing this for 25 years. We would hit the streets at night, making sure people would get to treatment, driving them to Louisville, to Healing Place, driving them to Lexington, to the recovery center there, just making sure that every opportunity that people wanted and needed would be provided for them. And so, like I said, our agency now is we have 3 offices now in Louisville. We have a East End, West End in Louisville, and then in Shelbyville. And I don't know that you all know, but probably 4 years ago, I was in Boyle County. I started a practice there. I was on Walnut Street over there, and had to close my practice because I had a car accident heading to Boyle County, and wasn't able to get back and forth from Shelby County. But we started there and was working with the courts with court-ordered domestic violence and DUIs, and we were providing services and everything there. And one day we'll probably get back there. I love the people from Boyle County. Those were my people.
Cassandra, don't be talking about Maple Avenue or Maple Street. That's actually where I got arrested when I lived in Boyle County on drug-related charges. So yeah, we'll cast that aside. It is exciting to me, though, to hear you talking about how clinically, how you're thinking about recovery capital, thinking about people leaving treatment, leaving incarceration, and how do we provide a sense of belongingness, a place where they belong, where they have meaningful relationships. And then hearing Roger and Ashley say the same, that they're seeing through the work they're doing in their organizations, that the landscape is different today than it was 10 years ago, that there's more, that society's coming around, that they're slow, but they're getting there. And that's really something we're grateful to see. Ted, we heard earlier from Kathy Miles about Casey's Law, which is a resource that could be really useful to family members who are on the call today. I'm wondering if you could give them a sense of what Casey's Law would look like in a courtroom, maybe what a family member can expect from that.
Sure. Well, in Mercer County, my office is very involved with filing of the petitions. She went over that pretty in depth. When we get into court, my petitioner will be called to testify. And essentially, I just ask them, tell the judge what's going on. Tell the judge, what's happening with your loved one. Give us specific instances of substance abuse, of substance abuse disorder. Why do you feel like they're a danger to themselves or others? The courtroom can be a very intimidating place. Casey's laws are confidential proceedings. So even though the courtroom is large, there's typically only 5 or 6 people in there, the court security staff, the judge, myself, the petitioner, and the loved one. So it's a real opportunity for family members and loved ones to explain to the judge, this is what's going on, and this is why we're concerned. My judge does a very good job of giving everybody a full opportunity to say everything that's on their mind. So when my petitioners come, armed with specific instances, we had ODs on these days, it makes it go along awfully well. The only caveat that I would give to anyone filing is to really take the opportunity to choose your evaluators carefully. It's always best if it's someone who knows your loved one, if it's a provider that's got a relationship with them, a doctor, a clinician, that really helps, because those reports will always speak, they speak for themselves. And having a good report and a good evaluation is a key to the judge having a probable cause to find that that your loved one is in need. And that gives us the ruling, which then in turn has the judge, tell them you're going to go into a 60 or a 360-day treatment program.
Yeah, thank you, Ted. That may make family members a little more comfortable walking into that, what could be an uncomfortable setting there. Now I'm going to take a question from the chat. Amanda asked, for those of you in long-term recovery, what would you say is the best way to advocate and educate others in our communities on ways to help those in recovery be successful? So Ashley or Roger, one of you all want to take that, or both of you?
I think that it's just, it's a process, it's something that you have to continue to chip away at. You're going to have these, not in my backyard, and you're going to have these things that happen. And every time there's a challenge, you just have to continue to recognize that, okay, this isn't a fight. This is an opportunity to educate and to share some experience and to show that change is possible. And so it's not anything that's going to happen overnight. It's just continuing to chip away a little piece at a time, and we've been able to start doing that. We face it every single day still, but I know that as this community continues to build, we're going to continue to knock down any barriers that get in our way.
Ashley, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, just trying to educate people. A lot of the stigma comes from people not knowing. They genuinely don't know, or they've really never seen success with long-term recovery. And so that's why I was so passionate about moving back down here and just showing up and being an example, because I think that speaks volumes. The people that were able to, say, they see it for themselves, oh, I arrested this guy 1 million times, or I prosecuted this guy 1 million times. And, look at him now. I think that is the biggest thing, but really just education. A lot of that comes from, just really not knowing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to stick with both of you all. We've got another question for you in the chat from Farron. What are some additional resources or relationships with community organizations that would be beneficial for individuals with a substance use disorder to continue to build their recovery capital?
And I can share a little bit of this. My experience working with the Healing Community Study, and we're this initiative, and we're working in Boyle County to create change in overdose deaths and educate people. And one of the biggest barriers, and I know Kathy can speak to this as well, is that the response from the medical community has been lacking. We have, I hate to say it, but we have a bunch of older doctors in our community that, we have to be able to educate those folks, right? We have to get them on board. Otherwise, we're never going to make any progress. And that's been a barrier for us in the Healing Community Study is finding medical professionals that are willing to attend education and training sessions about substance use disorder, about naloxone, about, any of these resources that are available. It's been a roadblock, and getting them on board will be a game changer for our community.
And it speaks to the importance of education, of people understanding what Ashley was saying, that when people understand, some of the stigma melts away. Sometimes we don't even have to do the fighting stigma. Just as soon as someone understands what's happening in addiction, it's like, oh, okay, I see that,
Sure.
Ashley, what about you? Other resources, community organizations that could be helpful?
Well, I had a incident last week that, one of my former clients, I just so happened to be at Walmart, and it was just a big mess, and the first responders, I feel like they do an amazing job, and they do a hard job, and I support them 100%. But I think that down here, I don't know if they do CIT training, crisis intervention training, but I know in Lexington and Richmond, I was really involved with that up there, and they would do their CIT training. And then on Friday, they would have a group of peers come in, peer support specialists, people in recovery, and they would sit down and they would talk with them and ask questions. And I just feel like that is such an amazing resource tool. And because I think that they do the best they can. But once again, they get sick of seeing the same person over and over, and that's understandable. But, I feel like if they had more education, more training on the issue, that it could be a game changer for sure.
Well, we're getting close to the end of our time here. I'll keep an eye on the chat if any more questions roll in, but I want to kind of end with my $1 million question, same question to everybody, which is simply, what do you wish people understood about addiction and recovery? What would be your message? And I'll let whoever wants to start take that one away for everyone on our panel.
Well, I'll start if I may. The thing that I want everybody to understand is that the addiction, knows no socioeconomic lines. It knows no educational lines. It's the very best families. It's the folks who are housing insecure, and it's everybody in between. And, these aren't abstract people. These are family members. These are loved ones. And just because you don't hear about it doesn't mean that it's not there.
Thank you, Ted.
I would say that going just along with what Ted is saying, I would say that it takes a whole community to help people to get better. I think reducing the stigma of saying those people over there. So if I had a wish list, it would be that we drop those people over there and recognize that humanity is just that, humanity. And all of us have areas that need strengthening and areas that we can do better. The other thing would be connecting all the village back together. It takes everybody from law enforcement to first responders to churches to families to the grocery store. I mean, it takes the entire village. It takes all of us pulling together and saying, together we can do better. Together we can do more. So that would be my wish list, is together we can make this happen. When our village comes together without and losing the you're this and you're that, and looking at all of our differences, but really focus on our similarities and utilizing that recovery capital that every individual has within them, that everybody has some strength to bring. And when we bring that in, whatever your weakness is, somebody's got you. That village model, that's important.
Alex, I would just say quickly that, in our community, when people see me in active addiction and they see me going into the detention center, 3 times in one day, they see me, getting caught shoplifting at Walmart, they see me doing these things and they say, Roger's never going to change. What I want people to realize is that Roger is doing the best that he can at that given moment. Like he is, he's at 100% right now. Like he is trying to do the best that all he knows. His brain is hijacked, right? And I'm doing my best. I'm just trying to survive the day. You understand? And when communities are investing in people, change is possible.
I'm old school. I just go back to, I just wish everyone could, realize that addiction is not a moral failing. I mean, it's sick people that we're dealing with. And I think when people start to kind of like what Roger said, when people start to stop looking at, what the bad parts and, really look at this person as a sick person and what can we do to help? I see so many people that complain and complain and complain, but then whenever they have an opportunity to be a part of the solution, the stigma, it scares them away. And so these are just sick people. And the majority of them don't know that there is a solution, or they don't know where to even start to get better in the treatment that they need.
That's well put. Well, thank you all for those responses. I've got a couple more questions here just to clean up.
Well, I just want to say, I know that there's a lot of people here from CASA, which is, Court Appointed Special Advocates. We're here in Boyle County. We work with children that, are on the abuse and neglect docket in family court. So obviously we work with a lot of families with substance abuse issues. we've had Roger to come and speak to our program before, and I think he really hit the nail on the head. I love having Roger come to speak to us because, where we have to advocate for the child, and sometimes that means removal from the parent and, permanent placement somewhere other than with that parent. That does not mean that I ever want to instill or, make any of my volunteers think that I want them to think any less of that person that's going through that. Because I will also say, this is a proud moment. I had zero idea when I logged on tonight, but that's my baby sister that's also on the panel there. That's Ashley. Had zero idea. And we have another sister here also. So that's kind of cool. So I always try to have the trainings that kind of equip and empower our volunteers to have that, awakening, because like you all have said all night long, it takes a village, it takes all of us. And I think the more that we equip our community members to realize that it's not, a choice, but it is the choice because of a diseased brain. And, like you said, that they're just going to interact with the family as well. We still have to sometimes make those hard decisions, but I love what Roger had told us one time whenever he came to, and spoke with us. And he just, he assured us that we were still doing the right thing, just like he said that he assures the people going through his recovery that they have to focus on their recovery. That has to be the first thing, And so I do know, and I often share in my training that, I know that reunification can occur because it happened for Ashley. So I really didn't have a question. I just wanted to get on here and kind of say that, I'm building up and I'm here for the, for your all's community, but I'm also loving the fact that we have so many causes on here, but because I'm hoping that it all kind of melts together.
And you represented CASA well. So thank you all for the work that you do. And it's just, again, to the point that it takes a village, that we've all got to do it together. And that includes protecting people from the harms of addiction, unfortunately. One more question for Roger and Ashley, those of you working in treatment. Do insurance companies pay for long-term treatment? What's your experience with that?
Insurance, typically what we see, insurance does not pay for long-term treatment, but that doesn't mean that you necessarily will have to pay out of pocket. There's a lot of different options. There's core vouchers, there's Unite vouchers. I work with people every day, even if they're not a good fit for Isaiah House or wherever, I really work hard to place everyone that calls me in the best fit for them. And there's a lot of different programs across Kentucky that you can get the help that you need, and a lot of different, means to pay for treatment. I wish there were more, I'll say that, but there are a lot of different ways.
Well, it's a good answer. And it reminds me that all of our organizations are using peers these days. And so if you're unsure, if you have a question, it's a great thing to do. Go to Shepherd's House or Isaiah House or Voices or wherever and get in touch with a peer, someone who has lived experience, because they really know the resources and they really know the barriers and can really help. So
can I say something about that too?
Please.
I would want to say the other thing is, we can box it, bag it too. So when you think of long-term, you're thinking maybe one long-term facility, but you can start from residential and then step back down into your community. So there's some ways that you can actually tag that in and then move down into outpatient and then move down to individual. You could tailor your own long-term. And then the other thing I would say is, especially for addiction, I grew up in a community filled with addiction and really worked really hard to come out of that, and learn from my brothers and learn from all of my friends, how to actually, want to be different or do something different. And really help to bring healing. And so it's very, very important when we start talking about long-term recovery, that we have to remember that recovery is a marathon. It's not a sprint. Mm-hmm. And just like we look in different areas to be able to get high and find drugs, and we'll go to the end of the earth to get high. We'll make up some big crazy story and go all the way to Cincinnati and back to get high. So that with that same tenacity, when we talk about recovery, we want that same energy on recovery. I'm going to go to the end of the earth to get clean. Clean is what becomes my goal. And that becomes, and so we want to use that. And all over the state of Kentucky, we are rich in recovery. Our state is rich. When you look outside of our state, people have not come together the way we have. Of course, Kentuckians are different because we're people anyway. But our state is rich when you look over the entire state to see what we have to offer individuals that are trying their best to get clean.
Well, I think that's the best place to leave it. If I were to pull out one quote from the entire night, it would simply be Kentucky people are different. We could just leave it there because that's really all we know. I don't see any new questions coming across the chat. I guess this is your chance. In recovery, we would say if you have a burning desire, this is the time to get it out there before we shut down. So with no new questions, I'll turn it back over to Lucy and the team to say goodbye.